The winter of 1745 in New York's Mohawk Valley carried a silence so heavy, it seemed to press on the lungs of every soul who lived there. Snow lay deep over the fields, muffling sound, yet beneath that stillness, a truth festered one so dangerous, that colonial authorities buried it beneath 3 centuries of dust and denial. That winter ended with 17 families gone, 43 men, women, and children wiped from existence in a series of attacks so precise, so deliberate, they could only have been the work of a mind playing war like a chess game. Whispers traveled through the surviving settlements. People spoke of a hidden hand and invisible conductor pulling the strings, sending death to the doorsteps of people who didn't even know their names had been written down as targets. But the truth, if it could be called that, was stranger still. The architect of this carnage was not a grizzled general or a foreign spy. He was 11 years old. He could converse fluently in English, Dutch, and Mohawk, and for him, war was not a cause or a calling. It was a family business. His name appeared only 3 times in colonial records from that season. Jonas, Kryton. Each mention carried a notation now understood by historians to mean sealed by gubernatorial order. No public eyes were meant to see those entries. What little we know about him today didn't surface from the brittle pages of archives or the chance discovery of an old letter. It came from the lips of a dying Mohawk elder in 1823, a confession recorded by a missionary who, in fear, locked it away and urged his superiors to keep it forever from daylight. The Mohawk Valley in that era was a narrow artery of settlement, stretching like an open wound across central New York. It was a raw frontier, dotted with Dutch patroons, German immigrants, Scots-Irish farmers, and English merchants, all clinging to the edges of wilderness. King George's War had turned this strip of civilization into a living chessboard where the pieces were human lives, and the French and British moved them without hesitation. French-led raiding parties swept down from Canada. British patrols scouted nervously, knowing any shadow between the trees could mean death. At the center of this volatile place stood Fort Huntermore, a collection of timber buildings and a fortress encircled by a 12-foot wall of sharpened logs. It was the main trading post for the region. Inside its stout stone residence, which doubled as warehouse and home, lived Hamish Kryton, one of the most successful arms dealers on the colonial frontier. He had come from Glasgow in 1738, bringing not only knowledge of European gun-making but also a nose for profit in the midst of chaos. Hamish's household was as tangled as the politics beyond its walls. 2 Mohawk interpreters moved easily between the worlds of native and settler. A French trapper, having switched allegiances, handled backwards dealings. A former indentured servant from Virginia kept the ledgers. Margaret Kryton, Hamish's wife, had died in 1734, giving birth to their only child. That child, Jonas, was raised in the midst of musket oil, gunmetal, and tense negotiations. By the time most boys were struggling with their first letters, Jonas was relaying messages between his father and Mohawk leaders, translating not just words but intentions. At 7, he was a walking bridge between languages. At 11, it was something far more dangerous, a mind that understood the weight of information and how to make it move men like pieces on a board. His height barely reached the shoulders of grown men. His eyes were a cool, metallic gray, and there was a stillness about him that unsettled even seasoned traders. The winter before, in 1744, had been especially cruel, and with the thaw came rumors that chilled the valley again. French troops, led by Captain Paul Marouin, had been spotted moving south from Lake Champlain. Even more troubling were whispers that Abenaki and Huron warriors had received shipments of British muskets eerily similar to those in Hamish Kryton's STOREROOM. In May 1745, a visitor arrived who would tip the scales in ways Hamish could not yet see. Captain Edmund Stockwell of the New York Colonial Militia brought grave news. Someone was supplying weapons to both sides, arming enemy tribes while also outfitting colonial militias. This wasn't just treason, it was a death sentence for families caught between the crossfire. A month later, the morning of June 14th broke unusually still. Jonas was in his father's study, his small hand copying inventory lists in an adult's precise script. Outside, 2 Mohawk warriors approached, their gait heavy with urgent purpose. Jonas recognized them, thence brother Colonial and a younger fighter named Conwatiti. Hamish was busy examining a shipment of newly arrived muskets from Albany, British Brown Bess models, each modified for lighter weight and sharper accuracy. When Colonial entered, his face carried the shadow of grim news. In halting English, he He relayed that the French captain wanted more fire sticks, the special muskets with silver bands on their stocks. Through the window, Jonas spotted a cluster of Huron warriors lingering in the tree line. Jonas's pulse quickened not from fear, but anticipation. He saw the contours of the moment in ways even Hamish did not. These weren't mere sails. They were moves in a far-reaching game, where the right whisper could tilt the balance of an entire frontier. Hamish agreed to the French request but raised the price, citing the danger of moving goods under the watch of British patrols. When the Mohawks had gone, Jonas approached his father with a question that seemed innocent, but which was already a seed of manipulation. What if the British knew the French were getting those silver-banded muskets? He asked softly. Hamish frowned. That's not talk for children. But if someone told them, Jonas pressed, wouldn't they want to know where they came from, and wouldn't they pay for it? The thought, though voiced by the boy, began to take root in Hamish's mind. Within a week, Hamish had made contact with British intelligence, offering himself as a double agent. What he didn't realize was that Jonas had already set his own wheels turning, writing letters in 3 languages to military officers, traders, and tribal leaders, each carrying just enough truth to be believed, and just enough omission to be deadly. His first independent move came after overhearing 2 Dutch traders talking about the Vanderburg farm. The Vanderburgs were prosperous, but isolated, perfect in Jonas's eyes. Peter Vanderburg had recently begun dealing directly with French agents, bypassing Hamish's trading post and cutting into Kryton profits. Jonas saw not just a rival, but an opportunity. Under the guise of delivering a message about medicine for a sick trader, Jonas visited the farm. While Mrs. Vanderburg prepared willow bark tea, Jonas spoke casually with Peter about French activity, sprinkling his words with hints of danger rumors that farmers near the river might be helping the French hide from British patrols. He let Peter draw his own conclusions. The seed took hold. Within days, Peter went to British representatives to assert his loyalty, which only placed his name on their watch lists. From there, Jonas began feeding carefully crafted lies to both the British and a Huron war party. By July 12th, he had maneuvered them into converging on the Vanderburg farming group, believing they were thwarting enemies. The massacre lasted less than an hour. By the time the smoke cleared, the Vanderburgs, several British soldiers, and Huron warriors lay dead, and Jonas, standing unseen, had proven to himself that with the right lies told at the right moment, death could be as predictable as the sunrise. The Vanderburg farm still smelled of burned timber days after the attack. The snow around it was trampled and stained, the silence broken only by the occasional caw of a raven picking at what the flames and bullets had left behind. Jonas stood at a distance, not hiding so much as watching the scene as though it were an experiment. He'd set in motion and was now studying for results. The experiment had been a success. Fear moved faster than any rider. Within hours, word of the massacre had spread along the Mohawk River. Families began boarding up windows, checking musket flints, and whispering about what could happen next. It was the perfect atmosphere for Hamish Kryton's trade. In the week that followed, he sold muskets to Dutch farmers terrified of Indian attacks, pistols to British officers anxious about settler loyalty, and even powder and shot to French intermediaries who swore vengeance for the dead Huron warriors. Jonas logged each transaction with care, his neat handwriting noting not only the weapon type and payment, but also the source of the sale. In his private notebook, he added details no merchant would ever think to keep: casualty numbers, the time between an incident and the first order, and the psychological pressure points that had driven each customer to buy. It was mapping not just events, but cause and effect, learning the exact relationship between blood spilled and silver earned. By midday, Jonas understood something most grown men never would: a well-placed rumor could be more lethal than a loaded musket. The key was to feed people what they already feared, to give them just enough truth to let their imagination do the rest. The next opportunity came sooner than expected. Through his network of Mohawk and Huron contacts, Jonas heard that a small Huron war party planned to raid the Henderson farm. The Hendersons lived 15 miles north of Fort Hunter, an isolated family of Scots-Irish settlers, with Thomas Henderson, a proud man who'd fought in earlier wars. The Huron intended the raid as a warning, not a slaughter burn. A few out, kill some livestock, leave the settlers shaken but alive. Jonas had no interest in warnings. 3 days before the raid, he sent word to Henderson through a Dutch trader, framed as friendly advice. French agents had been seen nearby. Perhaps it was best to take the family to Albany for a while. Jonas knew exactly how Henderson would respond. The man was too stubborn to run. Instead, He called in neighbors and within 2 days had gathered a dozen armed men at his farm, ready for a fight. The trap was baited. On the morning of the raid, Jonas visited the Huron camp. Speaking in flawless Mohawk, he told the war party leader that the Henderson farm was defended only by old men and boys. The real militia withdrawn to defend Albany. The settlers, he added, had been supplying British officers with information that had led to the deaths of several Huron warriors. Every detail was invented, but Jonas told it with the calm certainty of a man stating the weather. The fight lasted 3 hours. When it was over, Thomas Henderson and 2 of his children were dead. So were 5 Huron warriors, including their leader. The survivors on both sides left confused, each convinced they had been misled. Hamish's sales spiked again. Militia captains bought 47 muskets, French agents ordered 60 pounds of powder, and Mohawk warriors purchased pistols for revenge raids. Jonas noted the patterns in his book, pleased at how quickly fear could be recycled into new business. But, by August, the boy's ambitions had grown beyond manipulating single events. He began thinking of the frontier as a vast network of connections, traders, commanders, chiefs each, a point that could be pushed, pulled, or cut to change the whole. One such point was Isaac Clark, a German trader at the Noses settlement. Clark was struggling financially after French raids had disrupted his supply lines. Through Mohawk contacts, Jonas learned that French agents had approached Clark about storing weapons for them. Jonas saw an opening to remove a rival entirely. He fed the British a version of the truth that painted Clark as a willing collaborator with the French. At the same time, he told French contacts that Clark planned to betray them to the British. Both stories were believable because each side already suspected betrayal. The result was as brutal as it was efficient. Before dawn on August 23rd, British militia raided Clark's post, finding exactly the weapons Jonas knew would be there. Before they could haul Clark away, a Huron war party convinced Clark had stolen from them attacked. The crossfire left Clark and 10 others dead. Hamish moved quickly to take over Clark's trade routes, expanding into German settlements and raising prices. Customers, desperate and short on options, paid whatever he asked. Jonas's mind was already moving to the next phase. The Albany merchant, Samuel Wells, had been sniffing around French weapon sales, asking questions that hinted at ties to British intelligence. Jonas decided not to eliminate Wells outright. Instead, he would use him through tribal intermediaries. Jonas passed the French accurate information about British supply convoys, but with small, lethal alterations. He told them the convoys were lightly defended and carrying trade goods, not troops. In reality, they carried both military supplies and British intelligence agents, Wells among them. On September 14th, the French force ambushed one such convoy. The battle raged for 4 hours. By the end, Wells and 2 other intelligence officers were dead, along with much of the French raiding party. The survivors on both sides limped away, needing resupply, which Hamish was more than happy to provide. Jonas had learned that the perfect operation was one where everyone lost, except the man selling the weapons. But his most audacious plan yet was taking shape. It would not target a farm or a trading post, but an alliance. The fragile trust between the British and their Oneida allies. The Oneida had been among the most loyal native partners to the British, providing scouts and warriors for their campaigns. Through Mohawk contacts, Jonas learned of an Oneida war chief, Shenandoah, who feared British encroachment on tribal lands. Jonas began to feed that fear, suggesting that new British forts would be permanent, a way to control the tribe's movements. Meanwhile, he told the British that the French were making progress recruiting the Oneida for attacks on colonial settlements. The result was predictable. At a key meeting on October 3rd, British officers demanded proof of loyalty. Shenandoah, primed by Jonas's hints, took it as confirmation of betrayal. The alliance cracked. Oneida warriors stayed home during the next British campaign, leaving colonial forces exposed. French agents, sensing opportunity, stepped up their recruitment among other tribes. Jonas had once again turned a suspicion into a self-fulfilling prophecy. By the time the leaves turned, the boy had refined his art. He no longer relied solely on falsehoods. True information, delivered to the wrong ears at the right moment, could be far more destructive. And now, as winter approached, whispers reached him of a French convoy, 40 soldiers under Captain Jacques-Pierre Taffanel, carrying not just supplies but a substantial payroll. Jonas didn't see cargo, he saw the makings of his masterpiece. By late October, the Mohawk Valley had taken on its winter face, bare trees clawing at a grey sky, the air heavy with the damp weight of snow not yet fallen. Traders spoke in low voices, soldiers kept their coats buttoned tight, and every family, from Albany to the Noses, was counting firewood and food stores. But Jonas Kryton was counting something else entirely, the number of pieces he could move into place before the season closed in. The French convoy was more than a supply run, was an opportunity for something grand. 3 separate forces colliding in one place at one time, all convinced they were on the right side of the fight. Jonas had never attempted anything on this scale. The complexity thrilled him. Captain Jacques-Pierre Taffanel was leading 40 French soldiers and a baggage train south from Montreal. Hidden in those wagons was not only food and winter gear for the frontier forts, but also a hefty payroll intended to keep French troops loyal through the bitter months ahead. To most, this would have been a tempting target. To Jonas, it was a perfect keystone, something to draw in every faction with the right nudge. The first nudge was aimed at the British. Captain Edmund Stockwell, already suspicious of Colonial loyalty, thanks to Jonas's earlier games, was under pressure to deliver a victory. Through his father's intelligence contacts, Jonas fed him a story in pieces. First, a quiet mention: the French were preparing for large-scale operations that would require massive funding. Days later, a timely report: a high-value convoy, lightly guarded, moving through the region. The details were precise enough to be credible, yet altered in ways that would make Stockwell confident that he could take it. Jonas told him the escort was half its real size. He suggested the wagons held a payroll worth far more than they did. He left out entirely the presence of veterans among the French soldiers. By the time Stockwell pieced the intelligence together, the picture in his head was of an easy ambush that could secure him a hero's reputation. The second nudge targeted the Mohawk. Karanhok Tati, a respected war leader, had suffered losses that Jonas himself had helped arrange in earlier incidents. Jonas approached him with what sounded like urgent news. British forces were planning to attack a peaceful French trading expedition, one carrying goods and gifts promised to Mohawk families in compensation for past losses. If the British struck, Jonas warned, those supplies would be stolen, leaving families without enough to survive the winter. It was almost entirely false. Yes, the convoy carried goods that could benefit the Mohawk, but it was no simple trading party, and the British had no such plan. Still, Jonas presented it with the solemnity of a boy trying to save his friends from disaster. Karanhok Tati listened, nodded, and began calling his warriors. For other tribal groups, Jonas tailored the same deception. To the Huron, the British were thieves planning to rob gifts from their families. To the Abnaki, the militia was preparing an attack on neutral traders as part of a broader war on native sovereignty. Each version was true enough to be plausible, yet poisoned by selective omission. The third and most delicate nudge was aimed at the French themselves. Through Henry Dubois, a French trader in Jonas's growing web, he sent Captain Taffanel information about British troop movements accurate enough to be believed, but arranged to push the captain into poor decisions. Jonas hinted that British attention was fixed elsewhere, that the convoy could afford to move quickly with fewer guards. He also suggested that nearby tribes were friendly, even protective of French supply lines. The lies were laid like stepping stones across a river. All three forces, British, Mohawk, and French, were now set to arrive at the same point, along Deer Creek, without suspecting each other's true purpose. Jonas's satisfaction grew in proportion to the risk. He knew timing would be everything. Too soon, and one side might slip away. Too late, and the meeting would collapse into confusion without the bloodletting he intended. Like a conductor holding his baton over an orchestra, he waited for the exact moment to bring them together. By November 20th, the pieces were aligned. Lieutenant Colonel William Johnson led 60 militia and 20 Oneida warriors north, believing they were about to seize a lightly defended convoy carrying a king's ransom. Karanhok Tati and 43 Mohawk warriors moved west to protect what they thought was a trading party. Captain Taffanel marched south with his convoy. Unaware that either group was anywhere near, Jonas chose his vantage point 2 days ahead of time, a ridge above the ford where Deer Creek bent through a shallow valley. From there he could see everything without being seen. The night before, the forest seemed to hold its breath. He barely slept, running through the sequences in his mind like moves in a game. The morning of November 23rd, a pale mist clung to the water. Taffanel's men arrived first, making camp on the eastern bank. Scouts ranged the tree line, unaware of the noose tightening around them. From the south came the British, muskets ready, expecting the soft crack of a few shots before the French broke and ran. From the west came the Mohawk, convinced they were riding to defend friends and kin from treachery. It began with a single musket shot, a British scout, catching movement in the French camp, fired before orders could be given. The ball struck nothing but canvas, yet it was enough. French soldiers snapped into formation, returning fire in measured volleys. The British pressed forward, realizing too late that this was no ragged escort but trained soldiers holding firm. Then the Mohawk came charging from the flank. To them, the scene was simple. Their trading convoy under attack by British muskets. They fired into the militia ranks with deadly accuracy. The Oneida warriors, who'd come with Johnson, found themselves staring down their Mohawk cousins across the smoke, unsure whether to fight or plead for sense. Some tried to shield their British allies. Others refused to fire at all. The confusion only deepened the slaughter. For 6 hours, the creek ran red. 31 French soldiers fell, including Taft. Colonel Johnson lay dead among 28 of his militia. 17 Mohawk warriors and 9 Oneida fighters were gone, their bodies tangled with those of men they had once feasted alongside. By the time the shooting stopped, there was no victory, only bodies, smoke, and silence. Survivors stumbled away with stories that contradicted each other in every detail. The French swore they'd been betrayed. The British insisted it had been a trap. The Mohawk spoke of treachery, the Oneida of betrayal. From his ridge, Jonas watched it all with a stillness that belied the thrill in his veins. This was what he had wanted, a perfect storm where each side believed it was defending itself, where courage only made the loss worse, and where no one could fully explain why it had happened at all. That evening, back in Fort Hunter, Jonas entered the numbers into his private ledger: 85 dead, 7 weapon orders already placed, more than 300 muskets likely needed to replace losses. To him, Deer Creek was not a massacre, it was a harvest. The smoke from Deer Creek had barely drifted into the cold November air before rumors began to drift farther still. 70, maybe 80 men, dead soldiers, warriors, leaders, and no one could explain why 3 forces, each with different goals, had walked straight into each other's gunfire. To the colonial government in New York City, the massacre could not be dismissed as just another bloody episode in frontier war. Too many leaders had fallen, and too many alliances had been rattled. Governor George Clinton ordered an inquiry, sending Major Samuel Wells north to untangle the mess. Wells was no paper officer. He had fought in Europe, seen how rumors could cripple regiments, and understood that in a place like the Mohawk Valley, information could be more dangerous than powder. His orders were simple on paper: determine how 3 forces converged at the same point, each convinced it was acting in defense. But Wells knew the real task would be far more difficult: finding the invisible hands in the smoke. Fort Hunter greeted him with wary courtesy. Hamish Kryton, smelling trouble but confident in his record as a supplier for the British, opened his ledgers without hesitation. There were receipts for every musket sold, records of powder shipments, even correspondence with colonial officers. Everything neat, in order to neat, Wells thought. The first crack appeared in the time. Messages seemed to reach different parties with uncanny precision, always just in time to provoke action but never soon enough to avert disaster. The same pieces of intelligence appeared in British, French, and Mohawk circles, similar enough to be recognized, but each slightly altered in a way that pushed them toward conflict. Wells began to suspect there was not a network of spies, but a single mind, feeding each faction exactly what it wanted to hear. Then came the meeting that confirmed his suspicions. On December 15th, Wells sat in on a discussion between Mohawk leaders and colonial officials. Jonas Kryton was there, acting as interpreter. Wells watched the boy closely. It wasn't the fluency that caught his attention. He had met gifted young linguists before, but the subtle way Jonas shifted meaning. A Mohawk statement about soldiers taking food became warriors stealing supplies in English. A plea for peace became a demand for compensation. Wells understood Mohawk well enough to hear the difference. What struck him harder was how naturally Jonas did it, without hesitation, as if the truth was simply clay to be shaped into something more useful. That night, Wells requested a private meeting with the boy. Jonas entered the small office with the calm of someone who knew exactly why he had been summoned. He did not fidget, did not glance at the door. His gray eyes studied Wells the way a hunter studies tracks, measuring, weighing. "I think you've been very busy this year," Wells began. "Busier than a boy ought to be." Jonas tilted his head slightly, as though considering whether to deny it. Then he smiled, not the smile of a child, but of someone about to explain a craft to an apprentice. "Information," Jonas said, "is like gunpowder. The right amount, in the right place, can move mountains. Too much all at once just makes noise." He spoke plainly, without shame. He described how he had fed different versions of events to the British, the French, and the tribes. How he timed messages so that one man's fear became another man's certainty. How the deaths at Deer Creek were not an accident, but the result of carefully chosen words whispered at just the right moments. He spoke of people as if they were levers, push here, pull there, and the whole machine would turn. Dead soldiers and warriors were market indicators. Grieving families were demand generators. Deer Creek, he said, had been his most successful operation. Wells listened in silence, his soldier's stomach turning at the cold precision of it. The boy was not boasting. He was simply explaining the method of his craft. There was no hint of regret. I wanted to see if I could make them dance, Jonas said finally. All of them. French, British, Mohawk, Oneida. To see if words could be stronger than armies. Wells knew he could not put this confession in any official report. The idea that an 11-year-old had manipulated multiple factions into mutual slaughter would shatter confidence in every intelligence network on the frontier. Worse, if Jonas's methods became public, others could copy them. It would be like handing the enemy a new kind of weapon. After consulting with Governor Clinton, Wells made a decision. Jonas's name would never appear in the official record. The report on Deer Creek would speak of communication failures and unfortunate timing. The real architect would vanish from history. That left the problem of Jonas himself. He could not be left free. Yet, if he were prosecuted, questions would lead to truths that could not be risked. The solution was simple in form but fraught in execution. Jonas would die. On January 12, 1746, the records of Fort Hunter noted that Jonas Kryton had succumbed to fever during a winter outbreak. A small funeral was held. A grave was dug in the fort's cemetery, though no stone was set in reality. Jonas was taken south under armed escort to a secure house near Williamsburg, Virginia. There, colonial authorities intended to study his abilities while keeping him far from the currents of frontier politics. For 2 months, officials questioned him, asking not just about Deer Creek, but about the patterns of his thinking, how he identified weaknesses and alliances, how he decided when to use truth and when to use lies, how he anticipated reactions. Jonas answered everything, politely, thoroughly. Yet the interviewers began to notice something unsettling. The boy was asking questions. Not childish questions, but probing ones about their duties, their families, their habits. Several men admitted privately that they felt as if they were being examined in return, as if Jonas were mapping them the way he mapped the frontier. On the night of March 3, 1746, Jonas vanished. His room showed no sign of struggle. Guards swore no one had passed. There were no tracks in the mud outside. It was as if he had evaporated. The search lasted for months, spreading across 3 colonies. Some whispered that French agents had found and killed him in revenge. Others believed Mohawk warriors had finally learned the truth and taken justice into their own hands. A few suggested something worse, that Jonas had simply found new patrons willing to let him ply his deadly trade. Wells's own private letters contained the darkest theory, that Jonas was still out there, doing exactly what he had done before, turning rumors into bullets and suspicion into blood, orchestrating battles without ever firing a shot. For 77 years, the official record of the Deer Creek massacre told the same story: a tragic misunderstanding, faulty scouts, bad timing, and the unpredictable nature of war on the frontier. Historians of the early 19th century accepted it as one more grim page in the bloody birth of the colonies, but the truth sealed away in church archives waited for the right moment, or perhaps the wrong one, to surface. In 1823, deep in the Mohawk Valley, a man lay dying. Corin Hoktoti had been a respected war leader in his youth, a veteran of many campaigns. But the memory that haunted him most was not a victory. It was the morning at Deer Creek when he and his warriors had rushed to defend what they thought was a peaceful trading party, only to find themselves shooting at men they had once fought beside. A Methodist missionary, Reverend Samuel Kirkland, had come to the elder's bedside. The two had known each other for years, and Corin Hoktoti trusted him. His voice, weak but steady, asked the missionary to write down his final words. He told the story slowly, the way a man turns over stones to reveal what's been hiding underneath. How the British had seemed convinced the French were plotting an attack. How the Mohawk had been equally certain that the British meant to rob them. How none of it had made sense until much later. And then, the part Kirkland had not expected, a boy. The elder spoke of a small pale child at Fort Hunter, spoke their language like water, smooth, natural, without hesitation. The boy had carried messages, translated meetings, and and sometimes lingered at the edges of important conversations. It was this boy, Karen Hochdity now realized, who had planted the ideas that led each side to believe the other meant harm. The words had seemed innocent at the time, almost casual, but when he looked back, every turn of events traced to one of those conversations. The boy who spoke like water, the elder whispered, and struck like lightning. He did not die. I have seen his shadow in other wars, other battles. The evil that small hands can do does not die with the hands that did it. Kirkland, troubled to the core, sealed the transcript and urged his superiors never to release it. The story sounded unbelievable, that an 11-year-old had manipulated 3 military forces into mutual slaughter, and yet, the details Karen Hochdity provided matched elements of the official Deer Creek reports far too closely to ignore. The confession remained locked away for nearly a century and a half, until 1968, when historians gained access to the Methodist archives. The transcript caused a quiet stir among scholars who specialized in frontier history. Some dismissed it as the confused recollection of an old man. Others, more cautious, noted that the elder's description of the boy aligned with a few scattered long-forgotten colonial records about Jonas Kryton. Those records buried under gubernatorial seals placed Jonas at Fort Hunter in 1745, noted his unusual language skills, and confirmed his sudden death from fever. But the most unsettling question wasn't whether Jonas had caused Deer Creek, it was whether he had survived, and if he had, whether his methods had been used. Again, by the late 1980s, researchers at Columbia University began combing through frontier military archives, looking for patterns. In 1987, their published study pointed to 17 separate incidents between 1746 and 1763 that bore the hallmarks of Jonas's style. Selective information sharing, one faction receiving just enough intelligence to act, but not enough to understand the whole picture. Modified translations, subtle changes in phrasing that altered intent without obviously falsifying it, manipulated timing, truth or rumor delivered too late to prevent disaster, or just early enough to provoke an overreaction. These incidents were scattered across the Northeast frontier from the Hudson River to the Ohio Valley. Each one ended the same way: heavy losses on multiple sides, with no clear victor and an immediate spike in weapons trading afterward. No hard evidence tied Jonas to these later events. There were no signatures, no recorded sightings, but in the private notes of one Columbia researcher, a chilling line stood out. If not Jonas himself, then someone who learned directly from him. That possibility raised further questions. If Jonas had survived his disappearance in 1746, who might have sheltered him? Theories ranged from French intelligence to rogue traders, even to hostile tribes who might have valued his ability to sow chaos among their enemies. The idea that he could have trained others was even more disturbing. In the decades after Deer Creek, warfare on the frontier changed. Raids and ambushes became more sophisticated in their use of misinformation. Alliances broke apart not just because of battles lost, but because of small, corrosive doubts planted in private meetings. Traders became more central to the flow of intelligence, and the line between commerce and espionage blurred almost entirely. Some historians saw this as the natural evolution of frontier warfare. Others saw the shadow of the boy from Fort Hunter. The unsettling truth was that Jonas's methods didn't require an army, or even a formal network. All they needed was someone with a sharp mind, a good ear, and the ability to move between worlds and settler, French and British, without drawing suspicion. In the chaos of the mid-18th century, there had been dozens, perhaps hundreds, of people who could fit that description, which meant Jonas could have been anywhere, or everywhere. For those who believed he had lived, one question eclipsed all others: why no trace of him appeared after the 7 Years' War began in 1754. Some argued that the scale of that conflict made it harder for a lone manipulator to have impact without being noticed. Others suggested he had finally overreached and been killed. A few, perhaps most unsettlingly, proposed that he had simply stepped into a new role hidden within the very intelligence systems he had once exploited. The elder's final words to Kirkland haunted every historian who read them: the evil that small hands can do does not die with the hands that did it. It was a warning not just about Jonas, but about the nature of his craft. Lies, once told, could travel farther than the liar. Techniques, once learned, could be used by anyone clever and ruthless enough to apply them. By the time the Columbia study was published, Jonas Kryton had become more myth than man in the minds of most scholars. To the general public, he was a ghost story from the colonial era, a whisper of a boy who could turn neighbors into enemies and battles into business opportunities. But to those who studied the patterns of war, he was something worse, a reminder that the deadliest weapon in any conflict was not the musket or the cannon, but the human voice. And if the voice that once spoke like water had indeed survived its first war, there was no telling in how many others it had been heard. Before he became the ghost in the smoke of Deer Creek, Jonas Kryton was simply a boy in a house full of strangers. Fort Hunter was a crossroads, and Hamish Kryton's home doubled as its busiest in 4 travelers who dealt in muskets, furs, or secrets. The people who passed through his father's doors were as varied as the coins they carried: Dutch farmers with rough hands, French traders smelling of pine tar, Mohawk hunters draped in winter hides, and British officers wearing powdered wigs that looked ridiculous in the snow. Jonas absorbed it all. He learned early that grown men often spoke most freely when they thought a child wasn't listening. Sitting on the floor, carving a scrap of wood, or pretending to copy figures into his slate, he could catch every word of a negotiation. What goods were scarce, which patrols were thin, which rival traders were in debt. Hamish thought his son was quiet by nature. In truth, Jonas was training, memorizing voices, watching how a man's face shifted when he lied, how his hands moved when he feared he was losing a deal. Margaret, his mother, had died before Jonas could remember her. In her absence, the household had become a school with no set curriculum. The Mohawk interpreters taught him their language by telling him old stories around the fire. The French trapper gave him the rhythm of his tongue in exchange for helping to clean his traps. The Virginian bookkeeper drilled him in numbers and ledger work. From Hamish, Jonas learned about muskets, the feel of a well-balanced stock, the difference between powder ground fine and powder that clumped in damp air. But the most important lessons were unspoken. Hamish had an instinct for survival that Jonas inherited and refined. The elder Kryton knew that, on the frontier, weapons were more than tools, they were tickets to power. He also knew that loyalty was elastic. A man could be your ally in the morning and your enemy by nightfall if someone offered him enough coin. Hamish didn't waste energy on moral outrage over this fact. He simply learned to sell to both sides. Jonas saw that, and something in him clicked. It wasn't just that everyone had a price, it was that everyone had a fear. Hamish could make a man pay more for a musket by reminding him of a neighbor's burned barn. Jonas began to imagine other ways that fear could be fed, subtler ways. What if you didn't just react to events, but created them? What if you could give a man the idea of danger before it even arrived, and then sell him the cure? The first time Jonas tried it, he was 9. A Dutch farmer came to Fort Hunter to buy powder while Hamish was out. Jonas mentioned often, as though repeating gossip, that he'd heard Huron warriors had been seen near the farmer's fields. It wasn't true, but it wasn't impossible either. The man left with twice as much powder as he'd intended to buy. Jonas noted 2 things that day. First, the ease with which a casual remark could grow in the listener's mind until it felt like fact. Second, the satisfaction that came from watching the farmer ride away heavier with powder and lighter with coin. Over the next 2 years, he experimented quietly, never enough to be noticed, never so bold as to contradict Hamish's business. He learned to pitch his voice so it carried urgency without panic. He learned when to offer details and when to leave gaps that the listener's imagination would eagerly fill. He learned how to plant a suggestion in one man's mind so that it would be repeated, slightly altered, to another, turning rumor into a self-propelling engine. Language was his favorite weapon. By the time Jonas was 11, he could move between English, Dutch, and Mohawk without pausing to translate in his head. He could adjust tone, word choice, and rhythm depending on who was listening. The Mohawk, he knew, valued precision in speech. Too much embellishment made a man untrustworthy. The Dutch liked directness but responded well to hints of shared grievance. The British preferred the structure of formal statements, but even they leaned in when a phrase carried the weight of insider knowledge. He also understood that what you said mattered less than when you said it. A warning given too soon was wasted. Given too late, it was accusation. But given at the exact moment when a man was already leaning toward fear, it became truth in his mind. The perfect moment often came in transition: when a trader was packing for the road, when a captain was strapping on his sword before patrol, when a chief was deciding which warriors to send on a hunt. At such moments, a man's mind was open, looking for final information before action. That was when Jonas would drop a word like ambush, or French, or silver-banded muskets. He tested these ideas first on low-stakes matters: hint about the weather, the presence of game, the reliability of certain supply routes. When his guesses proved right, people began to trust his ear for information, and once they trusted him, he could feed them anything. The turning point came in the spring of 1745, when Hamish was approached by Captain Stockwell of the New York Colonial Militia. Stockwell came with news that someone was supplying weapons to both sides of the war. Jonas sat silently at the edge of the room, but his mind was already working. The militia wanted the name of the traitor. The French wanted more muskets. Both could be made to act, if the right story reached them in the right way. That was the first time Jonas began to think in chains of events, rather than single links. If he told the French that certain farmers were supplying the British, they would strike. If he told the British that the French were arming specific tribes, they would fortify. The strikes and fortifications would cause panic, and panic would bring buyers to Hamish's door. He realized something else that spring. He didn't need to lie outright. The truth, trimmed or dressed, was sharper than any fiction. A real shipment, a real meeting, a real grudge if bent slightly could become something entirely new in the mind of the listener. The Vanderburg Farm massacre, later that summer, was his proof. He had guided both the Huron and the British toward the same target, without either realizing the other was coming. The results were exactly what he had imagined: deaths, fear, and a surge in weapon sales. From then on, he stopped thinking of himself as a boy helping in his father's shop. He thought of himself as the unseen hand on the scales. He didn't just wait for storms to come, he learned how to make them. By the time autumn came, Jonas's methods were no longer experiments. They were a craft, and he was already looking beyond Fort Hunter, beyond the Mohawk Valley. The frontier was full of people ready to believe the worst about each other. All it needed was someone willing to give them a little push. By the summer of 1745, Jonas Kryton no longer needed to test his methods. He knew exactly how to bait a hook, how to hide the line, and how to make his target believe they had chosen the trap themselves. Each success only sharpened his appetite. Henderson Farm offered the perfect proving ground. 15 miles north of Fort Hunter, it was the kind of place most militia patrols forgot about: a seclated, self-reliant, and with a patriarch too stubborn to bend. Thomas Henderson was Scots-Irish, a veteran of earlier border skirmishes, and the sort of man who viewed danger as a test of courage. He had a wife, Sarah, and 3 children. Their neighbors respected them, which in Jonas's mind meant that deaths would echo loudly through his Mohawk contacts. Jonas learned of a small Huron war party planning to visit the raid wasn't intended to kill. It was a warning: burn a barn, take a few animals, and vanish. But Jonas understood something the Hurons did not. A warning is only useful when it can be understood, and on the frontier, warnings were often misread. 3 days before the raid, Jonas passed a message to Henderson through a Dutch trader. Delivered with the careful tone of a concerned friend, it warned of French agents in the area. Might be best, the message suggested, to take the family to Albany for a few weeks. Jonas knew Henderson would scoff at the idea of running. The farmer's reaction was exactly as calculated. Instead of leaving, Henderson sent word to neighboring farms, calling for men to help defend his home. By the evening of July 4th, 12, armed settlers were gathered at the farm. The stage was set. Jonas then visited the Huron camp. In fluent Mohawk, he told the war party leader that the Henderson farm was defended only by old men and boys. The militia withdrawn to protect Albany. Worse, he claimed, the Hendersons had been feeding the British information that had led to the deaths of 3 Huron warriors. Every detail was a lie, but every lie was a thread woven from truths the Hurons already believed. The raid on July 5th lasted 3 hours. When it was over, Thomas Henderson and 2 of his children lay dead. 5 Huron warriors, including their leader, had also been killed. Both sides left the field confused, wondering how they had walked into such a costly fight. Jonas didn't. Wonder he knew, and the proof was in his father's sales. Within a week, Hamish had sold 47 muskets to newly organized militias, 62 pounds of powder to French intermediaries, and a half-dozen pistols to Mohawk warriors seeking revenge. The same guns Jonas had helped sell the month before were now being replaced by new orders, paid for in the coin of fresh fear. But the boy wasn't content with one successful strike. His next target was Isaac Clark, a German trader in the Noses settlement. Clark was struggling. French raids had choked his supply lines, and debts were mounting. That made him dangerous to Hamish's business. Desperate men take desperate deals, and Clark had already agreed, reluctantly, to store French weapons at his post. Jonas saw the opportunity instantly. To British intelligence contacts, he sent word that Clark was willingly collaborating with the French. The story was salted with just enough fact to hold together. Yes, Clark had French goods. Yes, he had met with French traders, but arranged to make him look like a willing conspirator. not a man cornered by circumstance. To the French, Jonas whispered a different story. Clark was planning to betray them, offering his information to the British in exchange for protection and a bailout of his failing business. The beauty of this play was that both stories could be true from a certain angle, and neither side had the patience to look for the third angle, the truth. On August 23rd, before dawn, British militia surrounded Clark's post, acting on intelligence that weapons for French war parties were hidden there. They found exactly what Jonas knew they would, before they could make an arrest. A Huron war party convinced Clark had stolen from them launched an attack. The fight burned through the morning. 6 Colonial soldiers and 4 Huron warriors were killed in the crossfire. Clark himself died in the dirt outside his own trading house. Within days, Hamish moved into the vacuum, taking over Clark's trade routes and customers. Prices rose, quality slipped, and the settlers paid without complaint. On the frontier, choice was a luxury no one could afford. Jonas watched the takeover with the same satisfaction he had felt after the Henderson raid, not because of the profit, though that was considerable, but because of the precision. Clark had been removed without a single Kryton musket fired in anger. All it had taken was the right words in the right ears. By early September, Jonas's operations were moving faster. He had learned to keep multiple threads spinning at once, knowing some would tangle into knots without him having to pull them tight. One such thread was Samuel Wells, an Albany merchant with suspected ties to British intelligence. Jonas didn't want Wells dead, not immediately. He wanted to use him through tribal intermediaries. Jonas passed the French accurate intelligence about British convoys, but with a subtle twist. He told them the convoys were lightly guarded and carried mostly trade goods. In truth, the wagons carried both supplies and British intelligence agents, Wells among them. On September 14th, a French force struck. Expecting an easy prize, they found themselves in a brutal 4-hour fight against a well-armed escort. Wells was killed, along with 2 other British agents and much of the French raiding party. For Jonas, the result was perfect. The British had lost valuable intelligence men. The French had bled warriors they could ill afford to lose, and both now needed new weapons and supplies. It was the clearest proof yet of what Jonas had suspected since boyhood, that the most profitable battlefield was the one where everyone lost. By autumn, he was looking beyond single raids and rival traders. His eyes were on alliances themselves, those fragile agreements held together by trust and mutual need. And in the Mohawk Valley, none was more important than the bond between the British and the Oneida. The Oneida had stood with the British through years of war, sending scouts, sharing food, and fighting beside them. But loyalty, Jonas knew, was not a chain, it was a thread. Through Mohawk contacts, he learned that an Oneida warchief, Shenandoah, had begun voicing quiet concerns about British intentions toward tribal lands. Jonas fed those doubts. He asked questions that sounded innocent but planted seeds. Would the British really leave once the war was won? Could they be trusted to keep their promises about territory? Meanwhile, to the British, he fed another truth, one sharpened into a weapon. The French, he said, were making progress recruiting Oneida warriors for attacks on colonial settlements. The reality was far less dramatic, but the British didn't need much to believe it. The collision came on October 3rd, at a meeting with Oneida leaders. British officers demanded stronger demonstrations of loyalty to Shenandoah, primed by Jonas's whispers. It felt like confirmation that the British planned to turn on them. The result: the Oneida stayed home during the next British campaign, leaving colonial forces exposed. French recruiters, seeing the rift, redoubled their efforts with other tribes. Jonas didn't bother to watch the campaign's outcome. He knew how it would end badly enough for both sides to send their quartermasters running to Hamish's door. It was proof that a single question asked in the right tone to the right man could unravel an alliance years in the making, and he was only just beginning. By October of 1745, Jonas Kryton was moving pieces across the frontier like a master of a game, only he knew the rules too. The Henderson raid and Isaac Clarke's ruin had proven that small events could ripple outward, shaking alliances, redirecting trade, and opening the gates to more violence. Now he wanted to see how far he could stretch the threads, how many factions he could draw toward one place without a single one realizing they were part of his design. He chose his stage carefully. A shallow ford along Deer Creek, a place where the valley narrowed between 2 low ridges. It was an old crossing used by traders and war parties alike, flanked by thick pine and maple. The terrain offered cover for an ambush, yet the open water made it seem safe to the unwary. The keystone of his plan was a French supply convoy under Captain Jacques Pierre Taffanel, scheduled to travel south from Montreal to reinforce frontier forts before winter. Taffanel's 40 men would be carrying food, powder, winter clothing and, most importantly, a chest of silver to pay soldiers through the season. That silver was bait strong enough to tempt almost anyone. Jonas began with the British. Through carefully placed whispers to Captain Edmund Stockwell, he hinted at a lightly guarded French convoy, timed to pass through the Mohawk Valley in late November. He gave Stockwell exact numbers but halved the size of the escort, doubled the value of the silver, and suggested that half the soldiers were green recruits. He left one final suggestion hanging in the air. This was an opportunity to humiliate the French and secure a personal triumph. Stockwell, ambitious and wary of being overshadowed by colonial officers like Johnson, took the bait. Next came the Mohawk. Jonas knew Karen Hochtarty, the war leader, was still nursing anger from past raids. Meeting him at a trading post, Jonas spoke in the solemn tone of a boy delivering bad news. The British, he said, had decided to seize a French trading party carrying goods promised to Mohawk families as compensation for earlier losses. If they succeeded, the winter would be lean. Caron's jaw tightened. He asked for details, and Jonas provided just enough truth to make the lie breathless. There was a French convoy. Yes, the British were moving north, and yes, gifts for the Mohawk had been promised. Omitted entirely was the fact that the convoy was military in nature. Through other contacts, Jonas planted similar stories among Huron and Abenaki warriors, each tailored to local grievances. In every telling, the British were poised to rob a peaceful party, and it was up to the hearer to prevent it. The French required the most delicate handling. Using Henry Dubois, a trader with a foot in both worlds, Jonas slipped Captain Tough friendly intelligence. British attention was fixed elsewhere. Mohawk warriors in the valley were friendly to the French cause, and the road ahead would be quiet. It was all calculated to make Taffanel feel safe enough to move without doubling his guard. By early November, the pieces were in motion. From Fort Hunter, Jonas followed the progress of each force through runners and trading gossip. Stockwell, convinced he would face only a small French escort, marched north with 60 militia and 20 Oneida warriors. Karen Hochtarty gathered 43 Mohawk warriors, heading west to protect the convoy. Taffanel, unaware of either, moved south with his wagons at a steady pace. Jonas chose his vantage point 2 days before the collision, a rocky ledge on the eastern ridge above Deer Creek. From here he could see the ford, the tree lines, and the narrow slope where any retreat would be trapped. The night before, frost glittered on the grass. The valley was quiet except for the slow rush of water. Jonas lay under his blanket, eyes open, rehearsing the sequence in his mind. Each force would arrive within hours of the other. The moment one fired, the rest would fall into place. At dawn, on November 23rd, the French arrived first, setting up camp on the east bank. Soldiers unyoked the horses, stacked muskets, and began boiling water for a meal. Their captain stood with a map, confident in his position. From the south, Stockwell's militia approached in a line, muskets ready, believing they were about to rout an undermanned guard. From the west, the Mohawk moved quickly through the trees, intent on defending their traders from British attack. That it began with a single shot, no one would ever agree who fired it. Some said a British scout saw movement and loosed a ball that struck canvas. Others swore a French sentry, startled, had fired first. The truth didn't matter. The French line snapped into readiness. Muskets roared. Stockwell's men surged forward, then faltered at the unexpected discipline of their opponents. At that moment, the Mohawks swept in from the flank, loosing arrows and musket fire into militia ranks. The Oneida warriors, caught between blood ties to the Mohawk and loyalty to the British, splintered. Some fought, some held back, some turned to shield their own. The confusion deepened as each side tried to make sense of the sudden three-way fight. For 6 hours, the valley rang with gunfire and the screams of men and horses. By the time the smoke cleared, the toll was staggering. 31 French soldiers dead, including 28 militia and their captain gone, 17 Mohawk and 9 Oneida warriors lying in the mud. That there was no victor, only wreckage. Jonas watched from the ridge, unmoving, his face unreadable. This was his symphony, each section entering at the perfect moment, each note blending into chaos. None of them knew who had arranged it. None of them could even agree on what had happened. By nightfall, the survivors limped away with stories that contradicted each other entirely. The French swore they had been ambushed. The British insisted it had been a trap. The Mohawks spoke of defending the innocent. Back at Fort Hunter, Jonas sat by candlelight, writing in a small ledger. 85 dead. 7 weapon orders confirmed. Estimated 300 muskets to replace losses. For him, Deer Creek was not a tragedy, it was proof. He had drawn 3 armed forces into mutual destruction without firing a musket himself. Fear, trust, and timing had done the work for him. The first reports of Deer Creek reached Albany in the form of frantic, half-frozen messengers who could barely agree on what they had seen. In one telling, the French had ambushed a British patrol. In another, Mohawk warriors had attacked a peaceful trading party. A third version claimed the British had opened fire without provocation. By the time the stories reached New York City, they had grown heavier with political weight. Governor George Clinton's advisors argued that the incident could not be allowed to pass as just another skirmish. The losses were too high, the alliances too strained. The British Crown expected stability in the colonies, not a massacre in which 3 factions had torn each other apart for no apparent gain. Clinton needed answers, and quickly. Major Samuel Wells was chosen for the task. A veteran of European campaigns and a man with a talent for reading between lines, Wells was known for 2 things: his relentless curiosity and his refusal to be intimidated by politics. If there was a hidden hand behind Deer Creek, Wells intended to find it. He arrived at Fort Hunter on a frostbitten morning, greeted by Captain Stockwell's second-in-command and a garrison that looked more like survivors than soldiers. The militia's losses at Deer Creek had left the fort hollow, and the Mohawk warriors, who once visited freely, now kept their distance. Hamish Kryton welcomed Wells with the careful politeness of a man who had dealt with investigators before. He offered a seat by the fire, hot broth, and his ledgers neatly kept stamped with British seals, and showing no hint of irregularity. But Wells had been in the field long enough to know that a clean ledger could hide as much as a dirty one. He began interviewing survivors from all 3 factions, listening for overlaps in their accounts. That was when he noticed the patterns. Every side claimed to have acted in defense. Every side believed the others had moved against them first. And in each account, the decision to march on Deer Creek had been triggered by a piece of intelligence, a rumor, a warning, a scrap of overheard conversation that had arrived just in time to spark action. Different messages, different details, but the timing was almost identical. One Mohawk scout spoke of hearing from the boy at Fort Hunter. A militiaman recalled a warning passed through an interpreter. A French trader mentioned that an English-speaking youth had assured Captain Taffanel the road ahead was safe. The boy Wells didn't push too hard at first. He asked who the boy was, and every answer pointed to the same name: Jonas Kryton, 11 years old, son of Hamish, speaks Mohawk and French like a native, trusted by everyone who came through the fort. On December 12th, Wells arranged to observe a meeting between Mohawk envoys and British officers. Jonas acted as interpreter. Wells knew enough Mohawk to follow the conversation and to hear how Jonas shaped it. When a Mohawk elder said, "We wish to know if the militia will leave the valley in peace," Jonas rendered it as, "They demand to know if you intend to abandon the valley." When the British captain replied, "We intend to protect the valley from any threat," Jonas turned it into, "They say they will hold the valley against any who approach." Small changes, subtle shifts, but enough to bend meaning toward distrust. Night Wells invited Jonas to speak with him privately. The boy entered without hesitation, his gray eyes cool and watchful. "I think you've been very busy this year," Wells said. Jonas smiled faintly, as though the words were a compliment. "Busy people get things done." Over the next hour, Wells tried to guide the conversation toward Deer Creek, probing for slips. But Jonas spoke in circles, never lying outright, never admitting to more than being helpful to those who asked for his translations or his news. It was Wells's turn to watch. He noted the way Jonas's gaze lingered on maps, the way his fingers traced routes and settlements. This was not the idle curiosity of a child. This was the mind of someone who thought in movements, connections, cause and effect. When the interview ended, Wells stepped outside into the frozen night, his breath clouding in the air. He had no proof, nothing that could survive a courtroom or an official inquiry, but in his gut, he knew. The boy had been there before every move at Deer Creek, and every word he touched seemed to carry a spark that ignited something larger. Problem was that gut feelings weren't enough. In his official dispatch to Governor Clinton, Wells wrote that the massacre was likely the result of poorly timed intelligence and mutual suspicion. He noted the unusual role of an interpreter at Fort Hunter without naming Jonas. In a separate private letter to Clinton, he wrote plainly, "The boy is dangerous. His talents are not accidental. He must be removed from the frontier before another such event occurs." Clinton, reading both letters, understood the implications. If word spread that an 11-year-old had engineered a bloodbath involving British soldiers, Mohawk warriors, and French troops, it would make a mockery of colonial intelligence. Worse, it might encourage others to attempt the same. By Christmas, a quiet decision was made. Jonas Kryton would vanish from the public record. On January 12, 1746, the fort's register noted his death from fever during the winter outbreak. A small funeral was held. A grave was dug, though no one could recall seeing a body lowered into it. In truth, Jonas was taken south under guard to a secure house in Virginia. The plan was to keep him isolated, observed, and if possible turned into a weapon for the colonies rather than against them. But Wells suspected even then that control would be an illusion. "You can cage a hawk," he told Clinton in a final meeting before leaving Fort Hunter, "but you cannot make it stop seeing the sky." They took Jonas south in the dead of winter, bundled in a militia coat far too big for his small frame. The journey to Virginia was a blur of snow, river crossings, and long silences. His escorts spoke little to him, as though afraid he might turn words into weapons even in casual conversation. The safe house was a stone building on the outskirts of Williamsburg, set back from the road behind bare oaks and a low fence. It looked less like a prison than a well-kept farmhouse, but the guards at the door made its purpose clear. Inside, the air smelled faintly of cedar and candle wax. Major Wells had designed the arrangement. Jonas would have a warm room, food, and books. He could walk the fenced yard under supervision, but he would not be allowed near travelers, traders, or messengers. The boy's world was reduced to the house, the yard, and the men tasked with watching him. Jonas took it all in without complaint. For the first week he seemed to accept the routine reading by the fire, eating his meals in silence, answering questions politely when addressed. But by the second week, the changes began. He started with the guards. One was a young man named Bristow, barely 20, eager to please his superiors. Jonas asked him about life outside the house, the weather in town, the governor's latest orders, rumors from the northern fort. Bristow answered without thinking, until Wells noticed the boy's questions were always about movements. Who was traveling where, which ships were in port, which regiments were being recalled. Another guard, Pike, was older and slower to trust. Jonas didn't press him for news. Instead, he told him stories, Mohawk legends, French hunting tales, even bits of scripture in a voice so steady and earnest that Pike began lingering at the door long after his shift ended. By the third week, the kitchen maid, Eliza, was smuggling Jonas sweet biscuits and small scraps of information from the marketplace. "He's just a boy," she told the cook when scolded. "A little kindness won't kill anyone." Wells saw it differently. He doubled the guards and forbade unnecessary conversation with the prisoner, but the change came too late. Jonas had already learned what he needed to know: the rhythms of the house, the times when the guard shifts overlapped, the moments when the gate to the yard was unlatched. Yet he didn't run, not yet. Instead, he began probing his interrogators. Colonial intelligence officers, Carter and Drummond, were sent to educate him lessons in geography, European politics, and military history. The hope was to redirect his talents toward service for the colonies. But Jonas was no passive pupil. He asked pointed questions, weaving his own ideas into their lectures until it was unclear who was teaching whom. When Carter described the British strategy against the French in the Ohio Valley, Jonas interrupted with, "Why fight them there when you could turn their allies against them first?" He outlined a plan hypothetical. He claimed that would draw French and allied tribes into conflict without a single British soldier being deployed. Drummond dismissed it as fanciful. Carter, however, wrote it down. Weeks later, Wells would find those notes and feel an icy certainty. Jonas hadn't been speculating, he'd been planting ideas. By early March, Wells noticed another shift. The guards were bickering more, distracted. Small mistakes crept into the routine, a gate left unlatched for minutes at a time. A missing key returned to its hook without explanation. Jonas had become the center of the house's gravity. Without issuing orders or making demands, he had pulled everyone into his orbit. Even Wells found himself speaking more to the boy than intended, partly to test his mind, partly because there was something unnervingly compelling about the way Jonas listened. That spring, the first opportunity presented itself. A supply wagon broke an axle on the road outside the house, drawing the guards into a flurry of activity. Jonas, allowed into the yard for air, stood at the fence, watching. Bristow was nearest, keys at his belt. For one brief moment, the gate was open, unattended. Jonas didn't move. Wells would later understand that this was deliberate. The boy wasn't looking for an escape route. He was testing the cage, learning how far it would bend without breaking. 2 months later, in May, the governor sent word that Jonas was to be transferred to a military academy in South Carolina. The official reasoning was that he could be trained under stricter discipline, far from the frontier. Wells argued against it, warning that any larger network of officers would only give Jonas more mines to work on. His warning went unheeded. On the night before the transfer, a heavy rain fell over Williamsburg. The guards took turns drying themselves by the fire, leaving the boy alone in his room for longer than usual. Sometime between midnight and dawn, Jonas Kryton vanished. There was no sign of forced entry. No broken window, no pried lock. His boots were gone, along with a wool blanket and a pouch of food. Bristow swore the outer gate was still latched. When he checked it at 3 a.m., Pike insisted no one had left by the road. It was as though Jonas had dissolved into the night. Wells spent 2 weeks scouring the countryside, questioning ferrymen, traders, and even smugglers along the James River. A few claimed to have seen a boy matching the description heading north on foot, keeping 2 wooded paths. Others swore he had been spotted boarding a small fishing sloop bound for the Chesapeake. None of the sightings could be confirmed. By June, the trail was cold. Wells sent his final report to Governor Clinton, admitting failure to recover the boy. In the closing lines, he wrote, "If Jonas Kryton remains in these colonies, he will surface again, and when he does, the consequences will be measured not in battles lost, but in wars begun." Jonas's name was never again entered in any official ledger of the colony. To the record, he had died in the winter of 1746, but among those who had seen his work firsthand, the truth lingered like smoke after a fire. The boy was still out there, and wherever he was, someone else was learning how to speak like water and strike like lightning. Years passed, wars shifted, maps changed, and names that had once commanded fear were swallowed by history's long tide. Fort Hunter rotted into a scattering of beams and moss. Deer Creek, that shallow ford that had drunk so much blood, became just another bend in the river, its story fading into the haze of old men's fireside tales. But in certain corners of the frontier, in trading posts, military barracks, and tribal councils, a name still surfaced from time to time: Jonas Kryton. The accounts were never official, never written. They came in fragments, like bits of flotsam after a storm. A British quartermaster in Albany once swore that during the spring of 1755, a young interpreter convinced a Mohawk delegation to walk out of a treaty meeting, scuttling months of delicate diplomacy. That interpreter was described as a pale-eyed youth with a calm voice who vanished before he could be questioned on. In 1758, during the chaos of the French and Indian War, a French captain claimed that an American boy had warned his patrol of a British ambush just in time for the French to spring a counterattack. The ambushed British survivors later told their commanders they'd been led into the killing ground by false intelligence from a young colonial scout. The stories never agreed on his age. In one, he was barely a teenager. In another, he looked no older than 20. The details shifted with the teller, but the core remained: a young man with quick eyes, fluent in every tongue that mattered, always in the right place at the wrong time, and always gone before the dust settled. Major Samuel Wells, now graying and stationed in New York City, heard these rumors too. He kept a private ledger of them, noting dates, places, and outcomes. To him, the pattern was unmistakably incident, involved multiple sides turning on one another. Each ended with no clear victor, and each left someone richer in weapons and supplies. He began to see a shape in the shadows. Jonas wasn't just surviving, he was perfecting the art he'd learned as a boy. The stage was bigger now, the stakes higher, but the method was the same: find the fault lines, tap them with just enough pressure, and step back before the collapse. In 1763, after the formal end of the war, a letter reached Wells from an old French trader named Dubois. It was short, written in a cramped, hurried hand. "I have seen him again, not a boy now, eyes the same. He was with Pontiac before the siege. Told him of British plans, but in a way that made him fight sooner than he wished. The city burned. He walked away." The letter ended with no signature, just a smear of ink. By then, Wells had stopped trying to convince others. The governors had changed, the wars had moved on, and no one wanted to hear about a ghost who spoke in every language and could make enemies out of allies. To the young officers coming up through the ranks, such a figure was more folktale than threat, but Wells knew better. He saw the genius in Jonas's invisibility. A general leaves tracks, orders, correspondence, witnesses. A spy leaves contacts, caches, trails to follow, but Jonas was neither. He had no fixed allegiance, no banner, no cause beyond the pleasure of turning one man's certainty into another man's fear. His name was not in ledgers, his face was not in portraits. When he disappeared from Virginia in 1746, he had erased himself from the record entirely, and yet, like smoke from a fire long doused, the signs kept curling up into the open air in the spring of 1770. A Mohawk elder told a British surveyor about the pale fox, a figure who had once walked among the tribes as a friend, then as a rival, and always as a whisperer of trouble. The elder said he had not aged in the 20 years since their first meeting. Perhaps it is not the same man, he admitted, but the voice it was the same. That same year, 2 rival shipping companies in Boston collapsed after each accused the other of smuggling arms to French loyalists. Both accusations came from an unknown clerk who vanished once the ships were seized. Wells, now in failing health, read of these events and felt that old chill. He realized that Jonas had achieved something extraordinary. He had made himself into a myth. Myths could not be arrested, could not be tried. They could only be feared. In his final months, Wells wrote one last entry in his ledger. If Jonas Kryton still lives, he does not serve any flag, crown, or council. He serves only the game. And the game will never end, because there will always be another rumor to plant, another alliance to undo, another war to feed. Wells died in the winter of 1771, taking with him the only sustained record of Jonas's existence. His ledger was never found, the rest of the world forgot. But in the deep valleys of the frontier, where rivers ran cold and the wind could carry a voice for miles, traders still told a certain kind of story. They spoke of battles that began with a single conversation, of treaties that rotted from the inside before the ink was dry. They spoke of a man sometimes young, sometimes old, who listened more than he spoke, and who always seemed to know exactly what fear to name. They called him many things: the pale fox, the boy with grey eyes, the whisperer. But in the oldest stories, told in low voices around the fire, they still used his true name, Jonas Kryton, and somewhere, perhaps by a quiet river crossing or in the shadow of a crowded marketplace, a man with pale eyes might be listening even now, waiting for the moment to speak the words that would set another chain of ruin in motion.